Cordillera Blanca cuts through the Peruvian Andes like a serrated blade against the sky, its 22 peaks scraping above 6,000 meters in a wall of ice and granite that has claimed more lives than any war Peru has ever fought. Here, where the air holds barely half the oxygen of sea level and temperatures plummet to -20 Celsius without warning, the ancient Inca called this realm Ucumama, the mother of the deep, the place where the living world ended and the spirit realm began. By 1983, this desolate corridor had become something else entirely, a smuggling highway for Colombian cocaine cartels and a potential staging ground for Sendero Luminoso guerrillas seeking to establish mountain strongholds beyond the reach of government forces. Intelligence reports flowing into Lima's Joint Command suggested that Maoist insurgents were using ancient Inca trail networks to move weapons and personnel between the Amazon basin and coastal operations, transforming sacred paths into revolutionary arteries. The geopolitical mathematics were stark. President Fernando Belaúnde Terry's administration faced a two-front war: urban terrorism in Lima and Ayacucho, and rural insurgency spreading through the Andean highlands like wildfire through dry grass. American military advisors, operating under the aegis of Cold War containment doctrine, had quietly embedded with Peruvian Special Forces units to provide training in counterinsurgency tactics. The Reagan administration's fear was simple: another Nicaragua, another Cuba, another domino falling to communist revolution in America's backyard. What made the Cordillera Blanca particularly sensitive was its proximity to the Callejón de Huaylas, a populated valley where Sendero Luminoso had already demonstrated their capacity for brutal psychological warfare. 3 months earlier, insurgents had executed 17 peasants in the village of Lucanamarca, hanging their bodies from lampposts with signs reading, "This is how traitors to the people die." The message was clear: the mountains belong to the revolution. Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Mendoza of the Peruvian Army's 32nd Mountain Infantry Battalion had been tasked with establishing a series of high-altitude observation posts along suspected infiltration routes. His men were acclimatized veterans of mountain warfare, drawn from indigenous communities where stories of the Apu, mountain spirits, were passed down through generations like tactical intelligence. They spoke of places where the wind carried voices of the dead, where certain peaks demanded offerings of coca leaves and chicha corn beer, where ancient burial sites could drive men mad with visions. The local Quechua guides who worked with military units carried these beliefs like additional equipment. They warned of Malki, mummified ancestors whose disturbed sleep could curse an entire expedition. They spoke in hushed tones of the Nyapamachu, the ancient ones whose preserved bodies lay hidden in caves and crevices throughout the range, positioned as eternal sentinels over sacred territories. On September 20th, 3 days before the events that would ultimately be classified and buried in military archives, a team of archaeologists from the University of San Marcos had reported discovering what appeared to be an undisturbed Inca burial complex at 5,200 meters elevation. The site, designated Ancash 47 in academic records, contained multiple mummy bundles in remarkable preservation, arranged in a ceremonial pattern that suggested ritual significance beyond simple interment. The archaeologists had transmitted their final radio report at 1847 hours on September 22nd. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the expedition leader, described extraordinary preservation conditions and unusual acoustic properties within the burial chamber. Her voice, crackling through radio static, mentioned that several team members were experiencing altitude-related auditory hallucinations, sounds that resembled human screaming carried on the wind. Communication was lost 12 hours later. The last transmission consisted of 3 words, repeated twice in increasing desperation. "They are screaming! They are screaming!" 24 hours after that final radio call, Lieutenant Colonel Mendoza received orders to deploy a reconnaissance patrol to investigate the archaeological site's radio silence and assess potential security threats in the area. What his men would discover in those ice-locked peaks would challenge every assumption about the nature of death, preservation, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. Lieutenant Colonel Mendoza stood in the operations tent at Base Camp Huascaran, studying topographical maps that revealed the Cordillera Blanca's unforgiving geometry. The archaeological site lay 37 kilometers northeast of their position, accessible only by a treacherous combination of vehicle transport to 4,200 meters, followed by an alpine ascent that would test even his most experienced mountain troops. Sergeant Major Raul Quispe, a weathered veteran whose Quechua ancestry traced back 15 generations in these mountains, had assembled the reconnaissance team with surgical precision. 8 men total, 4 from the 32nd Mountain Infantry's elite high-altitude warfare section, 2 communications specialists equipped with the latest PRC-77 radio systems, 1 combat medic trained in altitude sickness protocols, and Corporal Diego Huaman, whose background in archaeological site security made him invaluable for preserving evidence. The men selected represented Peru's military elite adapted for extreme altitude operations. Each soldier carried the standard issue 7.62mm F NFAL rifle, but their equipment loadouts reflected the unique demands of their environment. Oxygen-conserving gear included modified breathing apparatus for operations above 5,000 meters, insulated sleeping systems rated to -30°C, and specialized mountaineering equipment that could mean the difference between mission success and becoming another statistic in the Andes body count. Private First Class. Marco Cawana, the team's youngest member at 19, had grown up in a village where his grandmother still left offerings of coca leaves for the mountain spirits. His inclusion wasn't coincidence. Mendoza had learned that indigenous soldiers often possessed an intuitive understanding of high-altitude survival that no amount of military training could replicate. They read weather patterns and cloud formations, recognized altitude sickness symptoms before Western medicine would detect them, and navigated terrain that could disorient even GPS-equipped forces. The mission parameters appeared straightforward on paper. Establish contact with the missing archaeological team, assess their status and location, determine whether their disappearance posed security implications for ongoing counterinsurgency operations, and report findings to Joint Command within 72 hours. Secondary objectives included photographing the burial site for intelligence assessment and collecting any materials that might indicate Sendero Luminoso presence in the area. What the official briefing documents didn't mention were the reports filtering in from local villages. Herders who worked the lower slopes spoke of sounds carrying down from the peaks during the past week. Not the familiar avalanche thunder or wind patterns they knew by heart, but something else entirely. Human voices, they claimed, screaming in languages that predated Spanish conquest by centuries. The village of Caraz, population 8,000, had recorded 17 separate reports of nocturnal disturbances that residents described as the mountains crying. Sergeant Major Quispe briefed his men on environmental hazards with the methodical precision of someone who had seen mountains kill careless soldiers. Above 4,800 meters, they would enter the death zone where human physiology began systematic breakdown. Pulmonary edema could incapacitate a man within hours. Cerebral swelling caused hallucinations, disorientation, and decision-making failures that turned experienced climbers into walking casualties. The weather forecast added another layer of complexity. A low-pressure system moving in from the Pacific promised wind speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour and potential whiteout conditions that could trap the team for days. Temperature readings suggested nighttime lows of -25°C, conditions where exposed skin would freeze within minutes and metal equipment became brittle enough to shatter. Equipment checks revealed the careful balance between necessity and weight that defined high-altitude operations. Each man carried 48 hours of rations, emergency shelter materials, first aid supplies specific to altitude-related injuries, and communication gear designed to penetrate the electromagnetic interference that plagued mountain operations. The total load averaged 32 kilograms per soldier, a burden that would feel crushing at elevation where every breath required conscious effort. At 0530 hours on September 24th, as the first gray light touched the peaks of Huascaran Norte, the reconnaissance team loaded into two modified Toyota Land Cruisers equipped with high-altitude carburetors and reinforced suspension systems. Their route would follow the Quebrada Laca Valley, climbing through landscapes that transitioned from sparse vegetation to barren stone to perpetual ice in a vertical journey that compressed multiple climate zones into a single day's travel. The last radio check with Base Camp Huascaran confirmed communications protocols and emergency extraction procedures. If the team failed to report within 72 hours, search and rescue operations would commence, though everyone understood that at extreme altitude, rescue often became recovery. The ascent began in darkness punctuated only by vehicle headlights carving tunnels through mountain air, so thin it seemed to resist their passage. Sergeant Major Quisp navigated switchback roads that had been carved into cliff sides during the 1970s mining boom, following routes where a momentary lapse in concentration meant a 1,000-meter plunge into granite-walled ravines. At 4,200 meters, the vehicles could climb no higher. The team transferred to alpine configuration, checking equipment one final time before beginning the foot ascent that would carry them into terrain where mechanical assistance became irrelevant. Private Chikawana, despite his youth, moved with the fluid efficiency of someone born to these altitudes, while the two communications specialists from Lima struggled visibly with the altitude transition. The trail they followed had been worn into existence across centuries of use, first by Inca runners carrying messages across the empire, later by Spanish colonial administrators, and most recently by archaeologists seeking to unlock the mountain's prehistoric secrets. Each footstep fell on stone polished smooth by countless passages, and in places, original Inca stonework remained visible beneath layers of accumulated debris. Corporal Huaman, walking point with his archaeological training providing context for their surroundings, identified several features that elevated the significance of their route. Stone platforms built into natural cliff formations served as way stations where travelers could rest and make offerings to mountain spirits. Carved niches held the remnants of ceremonial deposits, fragments of pottery, desiccated coca leaves, and small metal objects that glinted in the morning light. The altitude began asserting its dominance as they climbed above 4,600 meters. Breathing became a conscious effort requiring deliberate rhythm. Heart rates elevated beyond normal exertion levels as cardiovascular systems strained to extract oxygen from increasingly rarefied air. The medic monitored symptoms of acute mountain sickness with clinical attention, knowing that the difference between manageable discomfort and life-threatening emergency often manifested in subtle changes. Local weather patterns displayed the unpredictability that made high-altitude operations so dangerous. Morning sun gave way to cloud formations that materialized from seemingly clear skies within minutes. Temperature fluctuations of 20 degrees occurred without warning as wind patterns shifted around massive rock formations. The team adapted continuously, adding or removing insulation layers in response to microclimates that changed with each 100 meters of elevation gain. At 4,850 meters, they encountered the first anomaly. A section of trail that should have shown recent passage by the archaeological team instead appeared undisturbed, as if no human foot had touched the ground in months. Snow patterns remained pristine despite having fallen only days earlier, and the absence of equipment caches or supply dumps suggested the missing team had never established the logistical trail necessary for sustained, high-altitude work. Sergeant Major Quisp knelt beside what appeared to be disturbed earth, examining soil displacement patterns with the expertise of someone who had tracked insurgents across similar terrain for 15 years. The disturbance pattern was wrong, too regular, too geometric, as if the ground had been excavated with mathematical precision rather than archaeological tools. Small stones had been arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, but followed no recognizable system. Private Kawana approached the site with visible reluctance, his indigenous cultural background providing context that formal military training couldn't address. He spoke quietly in Quechua to Sergeant Major Quispe, gesturing toward stone arrangements that to untrained eyes appeared random but contained symbolic meanings rooted in pre-Columbian spiritual practices. The patterns suggested territorial markers or warning signs, communications in a visual language that predated written history. The team's communications specialist attempted radio contact with Base Camp Huascaran, but encountered interference patterns that defied explanation. Radio waves that should have propagated clearly across line-of-sight distances were being disrupted by electromagnetic anomalies that registered on equipment sensors but had no identifiable source. Static patterns contained rhythmic variations that almost resembled organized signals, as if something in the mountains was responding to their transmissions. Temperature readings began displaying inconsistencies that challenged meteorological understanding. While ambient air temperature registered -12 degrees Celsius, localized readings varied by as much as 15 degrees within distances of only a few meters. Certain areas radiated warmth that seemed to originate from beneath the ground, creating microclimates where ice melted despite prevailing conditions that should have maintained frozen surfaces. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the peaks, the team established a temporary observation post at 5,100 meters, within visual range of the archaeological site's reported coordinates. Through high-powered binoculars, they could discern structures that appeared to be expedition tents and equipment caches, but no movement suggested human presence. The site lay in a natural amphitheater formed by converging ridgelines, a location that provided shelter from prevailing winds, but also created acoustic properties that could amplify and distort sound in unpredictable ways. Evening approached with the sudden finality that characterized mountain environments, where daylight could disappear within minutes as shadows consumed entire valleys. The team prepared defensive positions for night observation, knowing that darkness would either reveal the truth about the missing archaeologists or present dangers that daylight had concealed. At 0347 hours on September 25th, the sounds began. Corporal Huaman, maintaining watch in the forward observation post, first detected what he later described as human voices carried on wind that wasn't blowing. The acoustic phenomenon defied meteorological explanation. Distinct vocalizations echoing across the peaks despite complete atmospheric stillness and no visible source within kilometers of their position. Sergeant Major Quispe moved to the observation point and confirmed the auditory contact through military-grade directional listening equipment. The sounds possessed characteristics that suggested human origin, but displayed patterns that challenged linguistic analysis. Tonal variations resembled speech rhythms, but the phonetic structure contained elements that didn't correspond to any known language, including the indigenous dialects spoken throughout the Andean highlands for over a millennium. The team's communications specialist attempted to record the phenomena using specialized audio equipment designed for intelligence-gathering operations. Playback revealed sound patterns that registered clearly on sensitive instrumentation, but somehow seemed diminished when reproduced through electronic speakers, as if the original acoustic properties required direct atmospheric transmission to maintain their full impact. Private Kawana exhibited increasing agitation as the vocalizations continued, his cultural background providing context that formal military analysis couldn't address. He spoke in urgent whispers to Sergeant Major Quispe, explaining that the sounds resembled what his grandmother had described as Aini Wakai, the crying of souls demanding reciprocal balance for disturbances to sacred burial sites. According to traditional knowledge, such manifestations indicated that ancient protections had been violated and required immediate ritual compensation. At 0412 hours, visual contact was established with the archaeological site below. Through night vision equipment, the team observed what appeared to be normal expedition infrastructure. Tents arranged in organized patterns, equipment caches positioned for operational efficiency, and supply distributions consistent with extended field research. However, no thermal signatures indicated human presence, and the complete absence of movement suggested the site had been abandoned for considerable time. Sergeant Major Quispe made the tactical decision to initiate direct approach under cover of darkness, reasoning that dawn reconnaissance might reveal their position to potential hostile forces while providing no additional intelligence advantage. The descent toward the archaeological site required technical climbing skills across terrain where loose rock and ice-covered surfaces created constant hazards of falls or equipment-generated noise that could compromise their position. The approach route descended through a natural corridor between granite formations that channeled sound in ways that amplified the mysterious vocalizations. As the team moved closer to the site, the acoustic phenomena intensified in both volume and complexity, developing harmonic variations that suggested multiple sources coordinating their outputs in patterns that resembled organized communication rather than random environmental noise. At approximately 200 meters from the nearest expedition tent, Corporal Huaman detected the first physical evidence of the missing archaeological team. Personal equipment lay scattered across the site in patterns that suggested hasty abandonment rather than organized evacuation. Sleeping bags remained in tents, with personal effects still inside. Research instruments sat abandoned mid-operation, and food supplies showed no evidence of systematic consumption or packing for departure. The team's medic examined abandoned equipment for clues about the circumstances of departure and discovered several items that raised immediate concerns. Prescription medications for altitude sickness lay unopened despite being dated for use during the expedition's time frame. Emergency communication devices remained in their cases, uncharged and apparently unused, despite protocols requiring constant availability during high-altitude operations. More disturbing was the discovery of Dr. Elena Vasquez's field notebook, left open to an entry dated September 22nd, the day of the final radio transmission. Her handwritten observations described acoustic phenomena that appeared to originate from within the burial complex itself, and noted that preservation conditions are unlike anything documented in archaeological literature, suggesting environmental factors that require immediate scientific investigation. The final entry, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, recorded temperature measurements inside the burial chamber that defied physical explanation. While external conditions registered consistent with normal high-altitude environments, internal readings suggested localized warming that maintained temperatures above freezing despite surrounding ice and permafrost conditions that should have created uniformly frozen environments. At 05:34 hours, as the team prepared to investigate the burial complex itself, the vocalizations ceased with abrupt finality that was more unsettling than their presence had been. The sudden silence created an acoustic vacuum that seemed to absorb even normal environmental sounds, leaving the expedition site wrapped in stillness, so complete it felt oppressive. Sergeant Major Quispe established communication protocols for entry into the burial complex, recognizing that underground exploration at extreme altitude presented dangers that could incapacitate his team within minutes if proper precautions weren't maintained. Emergency extraction procedures were confirmed, backup communication systems were activated, and each team member was equipped with personal locator beacons programmed to transmit automatically if vital signs indicated distress. The entrance to the burial complex appeared as a natural cave opening carved into the mountainside, approximately 2 meters wide and reinforced with stonework that exhibited the characteristic precision of Inca construction techniques. However, closer examination revealed architectural details that predated known Inca building methods, suggesting the site's origins extended far deeper into prehistory than initial archaeological assessments had indicated. The interior of the burial complex defied every principle of high-altitude environmental science that Sergeant Major Quispe had learned during 15 years of mountain warfare. Temperature readings inside the chamber registered a steady 4 degrees Celsius, despite external conditions of minus 18 degrees and no detectable heat source that could account for the differential. Humidity levels suggested atmospheric conditions impossible at 5,200 meters elevation, where air normally contained insufficient moisture to support the preservation methods they were witnessing. Portable lighting revealed a chamber that extended far beyond the modest entrance openings suggested, carved from living rock with architectural sophistication that challenged assumptions about pre-Columbian engineering capabilities. The walls displayed relief carvings that depicted human figures in various stages of what appeared to be ceremonial preservation, arranged in narrative sequences that suggested ritualistic purposes beyond simple burial practices. Along the chamber's perimeter, arranged in precise geometric patterns, sat 17 mummified figures in states of preservation that violated every known principle of natural mummification. Unlike the desiccated remains typically found in Andean burial sites, these bodies retained skin tone and facial features so lifelike they appeared to be sleeping rather than dead. Each figure was positioned in identical poses, seated upright with hands placed on knees, heads tilted slightly backward, mouths open as if caught mid-vocalization. Corporal Huaman documented the scene with archaeological precision, while Private Cawana remained near the entrance, his indigenous cultural background providing warnings that military training couldn't address. He spoke in urgent whispers about Malquis, whose preservation indicated they retained spiritual connections to the living world, beings whose disturbance could trigger consequences that extended far beyond physical danger. The team's communications equipment began registering electromagnetic anomalies that intensified as they moved deeper into the chamber. Radio transmissions to Base Camp Huascaran became increasingly distorted, filled with static patterns that seemed to respond to their movements and conversations. More disturbing was the discovery that their own voices were being echoed back through the radio system with slight delays and tonal variations that suggested external amplification. Dr. Elena Vasquez's research equipment lay scattered throughout the chamber in positions that indicated systematic documentation work had been in progress when the archaeological team disappeared. Digital cameras contained hundreds of photographs that documented the gradual exposure of each mummified figure, revealing a preservation process that had maintained not only physical integrity, but details such as fingernails, hair texture, and even what appeared to be subcutaneous blood vessels visible through translucent skin. At 0612 hours, while examining the central grouping of mummified figures, Private First Class Kikawana observed what he initially reported as movement in peripheral vision. Closer inspection revealed that several of the preserved bodies exhibited subtle positional changes from their documented arrangements in the archaeological photographs. Shoulder angles had shifted by degrees, head positions had rotated slightly, and facial expressions appeared to have altered in ways that suggested muscular movement despite the obvious impossibility of such phenomena. The team's medic attempted to take physiological readings from the preserved bodies using non-invasive scanning equipment and discovered readings that challenged medical understanding. While the figures showed no conventional vital signs, Electromagnetic sensors detected rhythmic patterns that resembled extremely slow heartbeats, approximately one pulse every 4 minutes. Brain activity monitors registered minimal but consistent neural electrical patterns that suggested some form of dormant consciousness rather than complete neural death. Sergeant Major Quisp ordered immediate documentation and withdrawal procedures, recognizing that their mission parameters hadn't included dealing with phenomena that appeared to transcend conventional military or scientific understanding. However, as the team prepared to exit the chamber, the temperature differential began rapidly equalizing with external conditions, and ice crystals started forming on surfaces that had remained warm throughout their investigation. The vocalizations resumed at 0627 hours, but now originated from within the burial chamber itself. Each of the 17 preserved figures appeared to be contributing to a harmonic pattern that created acoustic resonance throughout the entire mountain structure. The sounds weren't random screaming as local folklore had suggested, but organized vocalizations that followed rhythmic patterns resembling ancient ceremonial chants or ritualistic communications. Private Kawana collapsed at 0631 hours, overcome by what the medic initially diagnosed as severe altitude sickness, but which presented symptoms that didn't conform to standard high-altitude medical protocols. His vital signs remained stable, but he appeared to be experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations that he described as conversations with the grandfathers, in languages he claimed not to understand but somehow comprehended. The chamber's electromagnetic anomalies intensified to levels that began interfering with essential equipment functions. GPS navigation systems provided readings that placed their location at coordinates that didn't correspond to any known geographical features, while altimeter readings fluctuated between accurate elevation measurements and impossible depths that suggested they were somehow underground despite being inside a mountain peak. At 0638 hours, as dawn light began penetrating the chamber entrance, the team witnessed the phenomenon that would ultimately result in the complete classification of their mission reports. The 17 mummified figures, moving with synchronized precision that defied physical explanation, began turning their heads toward the approaching soldiers. Preserved eyes that had remained closed for centuries opened to reveal corneas that reflected light with the clarity of living tissue. Sergeant Major Quisp ordered immediate tactical withdrawal, but discovered that the chamber entrance had somehow reconfigured itself. The opening that had allowed easy access now appeared partially collapsed, reducing their exit route to a narrow passage that would require single-file movement while leaving them vulnerable to whatever forces controlled the preserved beings behind them. The extraction from the burial complex required 3 hours of technical climbing through a passage that seemed to shift its dimensions with each movement of the team. What had been a straightforward cave entrance now demanded rope-assisted navigation through sections where rock formations appeared to have moved inward, creating bottlenecks that barely accommodated human passage, while equipment scraped against stone walls that felt warm to the touch despite sub-zero external temperatures. Corporal Huamen, still semi-conscious and requiring assisted movement, continued speaking in what the team's communications specialist recorded as a mixture of Quechua, Spanish, and phonetic patterns that didn't correspond to any known language. His vocalizations seemed to trigger responses from within the burial chamber, harmonic echoes that followed them through the narrowing passage like acoustic pursuit that maintained contact even as physical distance increased. By 0847 hours, the team had cleared the chamber entrance and re-established visual contact with the abandoned archaeological site below. However, the camp's configuration had changed during their underground investigation. Tents that had been arranged in organized patterns now sat in different positions, equipment caches had been redistributed across the site, and supply containers showed evidence of recent access despite the complete absence of human presence throughout the area. Sergeant Major Quisp attempted radio contact with Base Camp Huascaran, but encountered communications interference that suggested deliberate jamming rather than atmospheric disturbance. Static patterns contain the same harmonic variations they had recorded within the burial complex, as if the mountain itself had become a transmission relay amplifying the vocalizations across the entire region. The team's medic conducted full physiological assessments on all personnel and discovered symptoms that challenged medical understanding of altitude-related disorders. While each soldier showed normal vital signs and oxygen saturation levels, neurological examinations revealed brainwave patterns that resembled sleep states despite complete consciousness. Blood samples displayed cellular changes consistent with extended high-altitude exposure despite having been at elevation for less than 36 hours. Private Kawana's condition stabilized as distance from the burial complex increased, but his reports of the underground experience contained details that hadn't been observed by other team members. He described conversations with the preserved figures in which they identified themselves as guardians of sacred knowledge that predated human civilization in the Andes, beings whose preservation had been maintained through centuries to protect territorial boundaries that extended beyond physical geography into spiritual realms. During the descent toward extraction coordinates, the team encountered evidence that suggested their investigation had triggered responses throughout the region. Local wildlife patterns displayed unusual behaviors. Vicuñas moving in organized groups toward higher elevations, despite seasonal migration patterns that should have driven them to lower altitudes, and condors gathering in numbers that exceeded normal population densities for the area. Temperature monitoring equipment registered atmospheric anomalies that extended across a radius of approximately 12 kilometers from the burial site. Microclimates that had maintained consistent readings for decades now showed fluctuations that suggested large-scale environmental changes originating from underground heat sources with no geological explanation for their sudden activation. At 11:34 hours, the team established contact with extraction helicopters dispatched from Base Camp Huascarán, but pilots reported navigation difficulties that forced approach patterns through corridors where electromagnetic interference didn't disrupt flight instruments. The extraction zone, originally selected for its accessibility and safety margins, now presented landing challenges due to wind patterns that seemed to originate from localized atmospheric disturbances rather than regional weather systems. The evacuation proceeded without direct incident, but aerial reconnaissance during departure revealed changes to the archaeological site that suggested ongoing activity despite the absence of human presence. Thermal imaging detected heat signatures within the burial complex that indicated elevated temperatures consistent with human occupation, while motion sensors registered movement patterns that followed organized sequences rather than random environmental fluctuations. During flight to Base Camp Huascarán, team members experienced psychological symptoms that the medical officer documented as consistent with extreme stress reactions, but which presented characteristics that didn't conform to standard combat trauma patterns. Sleep disturbances included shared dream experiences, where multiple soldiers reported identical scenarios involving conversations with preserved figures who provided warnings about territorial violations and consequences for disturbing ancient protective systems. Debriefing sessions conducted over the following 72 hours revealed inconsistencies in witness testimony that suggested memory modification or psychological interference that extended beyond normal stress-related cognitive effects. Each team member could provide detailed accounts of specific aspects of their underground investigation, but attempts to create comprehensive timelines resulted in gaps and contradictions that implied missing time periods or suppressed recollections. The archaeological equipment abandoned at the site was never recovered. Subsequent aerial reconnaissance missions reported that the burial complex entrance had returned to its original configuration, but thermal readings continued to indicate internal temperatures that defied environmental explanation. Ground-based investigation was suspended indefinitely pending evaluation of geological instability that posed unacceptable risks to personnel safety. Within 72 hours of the team's extraction, Lieutenant Colonel Mendoza received classified orders that originated from the Peruvian Ministry of Defense but bore authorization codes that suggested coordination with international intelligence agencies. All documentation related to the reconnaissance mission was to be transferred to special archives. Team members were reassigned to separate postings across different military regions, and the burial site was designated as a restricted zone under geological survey protocols that prohibited civilian or military access indefinitely. The official incident report, filed under classification level Reservado Especial, attributed the archaeological team's disappearance to avalanche conditions that had buried the expedition site beneath several meters of ice and debris. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her colleagues were posthumously honored for their contributions to Peruvian archaeological research, and their families received compensation for death in service to scientific advancement. No mention was made of preserved bodies, electromagnetic anomalies, or environmental conditions that challenged established scientific understanding. Sergeant Major Quispe was transferred to a training position at the military academy in Lima, where his mountain warfare expertise could be utilized for instruction purposes while maintaining distance from operational deployments. His personnel file contained medical notations regarding altitude-related stress reactions that required ongoing psychological evaluation, but no specific references to the events at Cordillera Blanca appeared in any official documentation. Private Cawana received an administrative discharge on medical grounds related to high-altitude adaptation disorders that allegedly rendered him unfit for mountain operations. He returned to his ancestral village in the Callejón de Huaylas, where local shamans performed traditional cleansing ceremonies designed to restore spiritual balance disrupted by contact with disturbed burial sites. His grandmother, whose warnings about mountain spirits had proven prophetic, conducted rituals that included coca leaf offerings and chicha libations intended to appease the Apu whose territory had been violated. The archaeological site itself underwent systematic sanitization by teams whose organizational affiliation remained classified, but whose equipment and procedures suggested expertise in environmental contamination rather than standard military operations. Satellite imagery from the period showed extensive activity at the location, but subsequent reconnaissance revealed terrain that appeared to have been restored to natural conditions with no evidence of human excavation or archaeological investigation. However, the suppression efforts couldn't address the broader implications of what had been discovered in the burial complex. Local communities throughout the Cordillera Blanca reported increased activity in traditional protective rituals, with village shamans performing ceremonies that hadn't been conducted for generations. Indigenous knowledge keepers spoke of ancient warnings about places where the boundary between worlds remained thin, locations where disturbance could trigger consequences that extended far beyond immediate physical effects. The temperature anomalies documented during the incident continued to manifest across a region encompassing approximately 400 square kilometers of high-altitude terrain. Meteorological stations recorded localized warming that contributed to accelerated glacial melt in areas where ice formations had remained stable for centuries. Environmental scientists attributed these changes to climate variation, but the geometric patterns of thermal distribution suggested influences that natural atmospheric processes couldn't explain. Regional folklore evolved to incorporate new elements that reflected the recent events while maintaining connection to traditional beliefs about mountain spirits and ancestral protection. Stories emerged of voices carried on high-altitude winds, speaking in languages that predated human settlement, but somehow conveyed warnings about territorial violations and the consequences of disturbing sacred preservation sites. The acoustic phenomena observed during the mission continued to manifest sporadically throughout the following months. Mountaineering expeditions reported unexplained vocalizations at elevations above 5,000 meters, while local herders described nocturnal sounds that resembled organized chanting rather than environmental noise. These reports were systematically dismissed as altitude-induced hallucinations or atmospheric effects, but their consistency across multiple independent sources suggested phenomena that transcended individual psychological reactions. By December 1983, the incident had been effectively erased from official military records and public awareness. The burial complex remained sealed beneath geological survey restrictions that would persist indefinitely, protected by bureaucratic barriers more effective than any physical security system. The preserved beings within continued their eternal vigil, guardian consciousness maintaining watch over territorial boundaries that existed in dimensions beyond conventional geography. The screaming mummies of the Andes had returned to silence, but their warning echoed through indigenous communities whose collective memory preserved knowledge that transcended government classification. In the high peaks where human breath became labored and consciousness touched the edge of spiritual realms, the ancient protections remained active, waiting for the next violation that would trigger responses beyond the understanding of those who believed death marked the end of guardianship rather than its eternal beginning.